All right, we're recording, and I'm here with the amazing Chris Cain, who is on the TASM podcast. I see, I always screw it up. The Author Success Mastermind.
The Author Success
podcast.
Mastermind.
Yeah, yes. I always mess up what the initial stand for. I'm always like the Author Successful. Yeah, so the Author Success Mastermind and the Right Away podcast with JP Reinflesh, who I just published a Vela with, which is fun.
Da, 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 da.
Yeah, which is super exciting. Are you on any other podcasts I don't know about?
No, this is the only podcast so far.
Okay. And you've written like 2 gazillion books.
Yeah, close to that.
That may be a little short.
I've written 60 plus books, a lot of them co-written under a super secret pen name. And I kind of just lucked into success after years and years of studying indie publishing, but I was next to homeless and went to 6 figures in under 2 years. And then Jay Thorne shanghaied me into running the Author Success Mastermind with him, which I just find absolutely delightful to be a part of.
It's amazing.
And I shanghaied JP into doing the Right Away podcast with me. And we're just all a bunch of friend and coworker stealers over here.
Yeah, I totally shanghaied JP too. He texted me in the Author Success Mastermind chat. He was like, "Hey, are you writing a Vela?" And I was like, "Not yet. Let's do one together." And he was like, "Oh, I was actually just asking you to be a guest on the podcast." I was like, "Too late." Now you're writing a Vela.
How many thousands of words later?
Yeah, well, we've written up to 26,000 words. We've done 13 episodes so far. We're only releasing weekly, but they're like 2,000 to 2,500 words. So, which technically is a short story, not a Vela, but I don't care. Amazon doesn't know what it's doing, so I can do whatever I want.
Do it your way.
That's right. Write whatever I want to until they put restrictions on me and tell me it doesn't count anymore. Yeah, so the reason I asked you to be on, and I'm excited you're on, is because you posed a question we were in the Author Success Mastermind chat, which if you're not part of the Author Success Mastermind, you should go do that. Where can they sign up for that?
If they go to www.theauthorsuccessmastermind.com,
nice.
There's info there.
Yeah, it's $14.99 a month, and it's totally worth it. You should totally sign up.
I think it's more than that now.
Is it more than that now?
It was that once upon a time.
That's what it was when I signed in. I don't even know anymore. Yeah, so, and I got in early, so yeah, it's probably more than that now, but it's totally worth it. So you hit me up in the chat and asked me if we could talk about. It's less that
I asked you. Yeah, I would say shanghaied you. I was like, we need to talk. We should talk about.
But it was a great question. You were like, expository stuff outside of dialogue, which is something I never talk about because it doesn't exist and it's worthless. It should be completely deleted. I'm just kidding.
It's literally like Jeff is always like, it should be what's your statistic, like 3 to 5
paragraphs only. Yeah.
Well, you're like 60 to 75% should be dialogue or more, something like that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, but the skills you're teaching for dialogue can carry over, and then all the exposition isn't crappy anymore.
Yeah, well, and it is true that like I think part of what I haven't ever just had an opportunity to talk about that your question made me excited is that like, okay, now that we've like freed you up from the expository monster, right? From the like, I'm writing like 10 pages of expository paragraphs. Like now that we have you writing dialogue, what happens with your expository writing? Because it doesn't just go away, right? Like nobody wants a like James Joyce stream of consciousness inner dialogue nonsense thing. Like
I'm like, even screenplays aren't just 100% dialogue. They're like 99% dialogue.
Yeah. So like what happens with all that stuff that like, yeah. So you sent me a piece that was mostly prose, which we can look at, or we can talk about it. What do you want to do first?
Oh, we can just talk about it. I would say that we go over kind of those categories that we talked about.
Oh, nice. Okay. See, I want to talk about the piece too.
You want to talk about? I do want to talk about the piece.
I spent time
for sure.
analyzing this thing.
Yes. Excellent.
Mostly
Well,
because it's the next book club for Dialogue Doctor. So
excellent.
we're doing this book for the book club, which I'm afraid to say the name of because I keep screwing it up. But
do you want me to say it? I can say
please do.
It's The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Cloon.
Yeah, see, I was totally going to screw it up. I was going to be like the Cerulean Sea with the house next to it. Like, yeah. So so you sent me, you just happened to, you didn't know that, but you just happened to send me that piece. And I was super excited to be like, yeah, I'm going to analyze the crap out of this thing. Yeah. Okay. So let's pose the question. What if you can free your manuscript from having to like dump prose to get your story across? What does prose become? Is the question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we kind of came up with like a list of 6 specific things
yeah,
that it can do.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious to anyone who's listening to this, if anyone comes up with anything that we didn't cover.
Ooh,
so I don't know if you ask a question at the end of your podcast, but I'm already saying that should be the question if you do.
That's an excellent question. I usually just ramble and peter out until no one is left listening. That's how the Dialogue Doctor podcast.
All right, so we're going to
ends.
ask this question early.
The Dialogue Doctor podcast actually goes like 7 hours.
Jeff however you can.
But nobody ever gets that far in the podcast. They're always like, Jeff. Okay, so let's just take them one at a time. And what I want to do is I want to go through one and then talk about how that's done well.
Okay.
Like how you've seen that done well. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So the first one we said was prose or expository writing serves the strategic purpose of pulling the reader into the world.
And I've memorized the first 2 sentences of this book, and it is exposition. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit, not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, nor a dry, sandy hole. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort.
I love so much that you've memorized that. That's amazing. Yeah, I would say that like 95% of the books I read start with exposition. I don't know.
Yeah, we've got to, it is in most situations a framing device. Like the one case where I can really think of that starts with pure dialogue that works for me is The Matrix. Like you've kind of got a black screen and all you hear are the voices, but it doesn't stay there for long. And I haven't really seen that in text in a book.
We did a
to that level.
Yeah, we did this. The Dialogue Dr. Slack did a short story by Ray Bradbury called All Summers in a Day. And it starts with just dialogue. And you don't know who's talking, like The Matrix. And one of the things in analyzing that story and thinking through like, okay, other stories that do this, it's an intentional device of confusion. Mm-hmm. If you start with just dialogue, you're intentionally trying to like set an emotional tone in order to like get the emotions in front of the image. Does that make sense? Like, which is what The Matrix is doing. Like they're trying to get the emotions of the moment out in front of any like sense that you have in the world. So it's almost like you're starting the piece with the reader in an intentional fog, making them feel something before they see something in their mind. And that's what dialogue. Yeah,
I was gonna say, I think kind of where it works best is when it is not necessarily a mystery genre book, but there's a strong mystery element.
Yeah, because you want that feeling of like anxiety. I don't fully know what's going on when you start with dialogue. Like that's what it does. So yeah, again, I love that you did The Hobbit. And I think when people do that best, when they're like best setting the world, it's like the thing that you just quoted, like crisp, tight, intense descriptions. Not intense like emotionally intense, but intense like, man, these first sentences are creating a visual image for me that sets a tone that like I need to be a part of. Yeah.
We talk about first lines of books a lot, and that's for that exact reason. This is your reader's first intro, and more, for the improvement or devolvement of literature, it's becoming extremely important to grab readers as fast as possible.
Yeah, you got to get them in the first page, or they're not getting the page two. Yeah. So I think that's the first great use case. Anything else you want to add to that before we move on to use case number two?
I did want to say that I just checked this. There is a literary equivalent of the starting with just dialogue, and that's Ender's Game.
See, I've never read Ender's Game,
and it's there's a lot of people have ethical reasons to not buy out Orson Scott Card. Absolutely understand. Ender's Game is still one of my favorite stories, and it has a framework, and I was actually looking this up for a POV workshop I'm doing.
I have read Ender's Game. Never mind. Sorry, keep going.
Where they're like the beginning of each chapter starts with untagged dialogue.
Mm-hmm. That's what I was thinking.
And it's the adult POV, and it's almost always untagged, and maybe sometimes a character name is referenced in the dialogue, but it's always untagged dialogue. Yeah.
Well, the piece that you sent me from the house underneath the Cerulean Sea on the cliff by the moor is also starts with just dialogue. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anyway, it can happen.
I think it's chapter 2.
Is that chapter 2?
I think it's chapter 2.
Okay. Okay. So number 2 thing you can do strategically with exposition once you have stopped using it to like plow through your story is create moments of wonder.
It's hard to do that with because in moments, it's hard to do that with dialogue, because in moments of wonder we stop talking.
Yeah. And I think of like there's this like the illustration I use all the time because it works for my brain is that like if you're like wanting to examine a forest, dialogue is like walking amongst the trees where you're like present in the moment and you're like taking in the air and you're like feeling the leaves beneath your feet and you can like touch the bark and you're like surrounded by the trees. And then exposition is like getting in the helicopter and looking down on the forest from 40,000 feet. But if you want a sense of wonder and awe, get in the helicopter and look down on the forest from 40,000 feet. Right. Like it's that like you got to back up and look at things and get out of the weeds to really like appreciate the scenery. But I think the key is that like you have to have been in the weeds for that moment of awe to really resonate.
Yeah. So it's and I don't know that we necessarily said this specifically in our list of 6, so maybe this is a 7th, but you also can control the pacing. Like you control pacing some with like the rhythm of your dialogue, but you can also control pacing with the spacing of your exposition. If there's not much exposition, you're in a very fast-paced scene, you're snapping back and forth with your dialogue. You add more exposition, it slows the scene down, and sometimes that's something you want to do. That is what adds to that a sense of wonder. Is you're slowing the moment down, you're stretching it out on purpose, not just because you don't know what you're doing and you're just describing everything.
Yeah, especially in that like dark night of the soul moment where you like need to slow everything down and spend this like reflective moment of like what's going on, like lots of like increasing your exposition there creates that sense of pain and slowness. I'm thinking of like,
and if we just wanted to even like replace that sense of wonder, even though I think that's great, increase the importance of something. If you want to show the importance of something, you simply spend more time on it.
I'm thinking specifically in my head is ringing out this example from the Toni Morrison's Beloved, where Paul D is investigating why Sethi is like isolated in this house by herself, and like because he doesn't know like what she's done that's created this reputation for her, and the exposition jumps like 5-fold as he's learning that, like, spoiler alert, as he's learning that like she killed a child. And so like the exposition, and that's actually the ghost. He's figuring out that that's the ghost that's haunting her, that like the exposition like jumps like 5-fold for him too. Like as he's figuring that out, like everything, she slows everything down and like just makes you sit in this moment. as he's like
Yes.
discovering this like intense thing. But yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Number 3. Ooh, sorry, I'm gonna go back to this. My favorite book with way too much exposition that like beautifully creates this sense of wonder is C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, which is not at all about divorce.
No.
It's it paints this weird picture of the afterlife, but I got lost. He's got the afterlife for him is called Gray Street, I think he calls it, where it's like this nondescript kind of British, you know, row home-esque area that's ever expanding as more people die, and they just get further and further away from the center. Like it's just this like ever expanding exact like number, every street is the exact same, and they just go further and further out, and it's actually people are joining in the middle, and so it's like growing from the middle. So the longer you've been dead, the further out from the center you are. And like he's like, if you walk far enough you can meet Napoleon, and like, you know, he talks about like going to meet all these old people, but you have to like walk way far out. You just, if you just keep walking, you'll finally find like the first people born. But it's this, I got lost in like the pages of that description. And it was, but it was one of those senses of wonder, like just creating this moment that I wanted to like sit in and understand in a deeper way, which was really, was really well done and great. Okay, anything else about moments of wonder or about controlling your pacing and like increasing intensity with exposition?
No.
Okay.
No.
So number 4 would be giving spatial awareness to imagination.
No,
So
I'm just correcting that with number 3 so that people listening don't get confused.
Oh, but we added one. We added an extra.
Oh, we added one. Okay,
yes, we're on 4 now.
All right. Now I'm getting confused simply because it doesn't match the old list.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I changed the list up on you.
So spatial awareness.
Spatial awareness. So I just read a piece this week from an author. I actually wrote my newsletter about it today, which will give people indications to when we're recording this versus when I post it. Which is always a fun game to play with podcasts. When was this recorded versus when was it posted? In which like she had gone so heavy in the dialogue, I didn't know where the characters were. Like I couldn't create a visual image of the scene because she needed more exposition. So I think it's the first time I've ever told a writer, like, I need you to add a paragraph here explaining where they are.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it's kind of I think it's generally referred to as like the white room problem. The characters are talking in an empty white room. Like you have no idea, are they in a post office? Are they in a living room? Are they in a doctor's office? Those are all going to have like change the connotations of the conversations they're having.
Yeah. And I need to know like when they move in the scene, I need a paragraph that like tells me where everybody is and where they're going and what's going on. And it doesn't always have to be a paragraph. Like there's tricks to do it where you don't have to like write a full paragraph, but sometimes a paragraph just helps. Like, like they walked into the library and here's what the library looks like. Like it helps me as the reader, like create an image of, And the piece you sent me that we'll look at in a minute, the house next to the Cerulean Sea in the distance, is he's doing that in the first 2 pages. He's like setting the scene for you so you like fully appreciate the conversation that's coming. But anyway. Okay, number 5. Number 5
now.
See, but we've already done number 5. We doubled ourselves because we have number 5 is enhancing the emotional experience. Or is that different than what we talked about with pacing time?
It's a bit different for me, because the words you are using, you can still you can spend a very short amount of time. The certain words that you use to describe something are going to give it a different emotional experience. So this is less to do about like how much time you spend on something and more about the particular words that you are using, though there's a lot of tricks to enhance the emotional experience. And so this isn't like he said Riley, he shouted. It's not about how they say something. It's about specifically I like thinking about whether it's in first or third person. I really haven't studied omniscient enough to like figure out the nuances of it, but it does work for omniscient as well. But like, is the sky, you know, a warm gray, or is it, you know, is the rain a warm spring sprinkle, or is it a drizzle? Those have very different emotional contexts, and that's going to set the emotional context for the scene.
Yeah. I think there's a scene in The Book Thief by Mark Zukakas that has just stuck with me since I read it. They're all the characters are in a basement during a bombing raid, and they're having this conversation, like waiting for the bombs to drop. And they hear a plane going overhead, and he drops in this paragraph of exposition. And in the paragraph, he says, "The silence punched and kicked everyone in the room."
Mm-hmm.
And it's always stuck. I'm like, man, that I know that silence. I understand that silence. And that description has stayed with me forever. Like, it's just,
yeah. There's a smothering silence. There's, you know, there's a
mm-hmm.
dead silence. There's a loud silence. There's a punching and kicking silence.
Yeah. But just that image in that exposition of the silence punching and kicking people in the room, it just was like, oh, like that exposition just set the tone for the moment.
And I think also that that this is one of the ways where you can give that subtext of what a reader is saying, not matching what they're actually meaning or feeling. So when your POV character is hearing, "I'm fine," but they're like, you know, the other character's shoulders are slumped, like that's all going to be in your exposition, all in your description. You know, he slouches over to the decanter and you know, knocks the crystal top to the table. You know, I flinch, wondering, like, you know, anticipating the shatter. You know, "I'm fine" does not match with those actions. So you're enhancing that emotional exchange there, because there's the difference. So you can, like, you know, have them in congruence with each other. So you're emphasizing whatever the said emotion is with the actions, or in dissonance with each other. So you're like, oh, something is not flowing here.
Yeah, that makes me think of, like, it's really great to have a really strong expositional paragraph when, and this kind of goes to that moment of reflection we were talking about, but in the middle of an emotional change in the flow of the story, like, especially if you're going toward a negative emotion like sadness or horror or fear, like those emotions we, you know, tend to assume is like fight or flight emotions, or like, you know, devastation type emotions. Having a paragraph of expositional reflection where like all your characters, or you just like take a moment to describe the like setting in which your characters are in. Like, you don't want to describe how your characters are feeling, because that actually pulls away from the moment, but taking a minute to just describing the like tone and the setting of the room, and like, you know, or even like you're describing like the body posture of a character, or like sometimes I've seen this really great thing happen where we get to the end of a chapter and there's been a really heavy conversation, and then there'll be a paragraph of just like one of the characters sitting and reflecting on what happened. You don't have to tell me what their thoughts are. You can just describe their reflection, and it adds to that, like the weightiness of what just went on. Yeah. I'm trying to think of a good example of that, but nothing's coming to mind. So I'm not going to make one up. I'm not going to force one in there that somebody might check me on later and be like, that didn't happen. So number 5.
I mean, it happens in romance a lot after the main characters have had one of their inevitable clashes against each other. Like often, I'm thinking of Bridgerton specifically at the moment, where the heroine will like say something snappy, and then she'll leave, and then the male hero just kind of stares after her for a minute. Like, that's the quintessential scene I'm
describing. That stare is super important.
Yeah,
I'm with you in that. Okay, number 5, the passage of time.
And I don't think there's much to say about this, but this is something necessary. It's one of those, you know, little cogs we need to just let people know, like, when there's been a time jump, or just kind of how close or how far things are from each other.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would want to say about it is that you shouldn't assume you need it. It needs to be strategic, because a lot of times you
Mm-hmm.
can work a time jump into the conversation itself in an artful way that doesn't make people feel like you're working it into the conversation. That's
Yeah,
always the tough
I was like,
part.
because a lot of people are like, oh my goodness, it has been 12 months since we last saw each other.
No, yeah, but like
Like that's what you don't want to do.
that's what
And
you
what I
don't want to
think,
do.
and so like how I would do it in exposition is very much in the description. If the last scene it was a storming winter night, now you have it be spring, and the buds are coming out and the birds are singing, and so you show the physical passage of time.
Yeah. Oh, my favorite like visual illustration of that, this just comes to mind, is, which is in a movie, not a book, so it's not totally helpful, but I'm going to share it anyway, is in Notting Hill with Hugh Grant and Julia Roberts.
Been so long since I've seen that.
Oh, it's such a great movie. There's a scene where she leaves and he's like going back to his normal life without her. And there's
Is this the one where he's a cancer patient?
no, this is the one where he
Okay.
runs a travel bookstore.
Okay, I
And
don't think I've actually seen this one. Anyways.
She's a Hollywood starlet who happens to walk into his travel bookstore to escape the paparazzi, and ends up like coming to his house, and they fall in love, but then she like disappears and he doesn't see her again, and she keeps popping back into his life in weird times, like creating chaos. And it's a big question of like, he's asking like, why does she keep coming back? So it's but there's a scene where he's like in between contact with her, and he's walking down a street, and as he's walking he puts on a coat, and then he like turns the collar up, and it like starts raining a little bit, like it's very subtle, and then all of a sudden the rain turns to snow and he's like cold, and then it like goes back to warmth, and he like takes the coat off and like keeps walking, and it shows like the passage of
Oh
a
yeah, that's
year.
great.
Oh, it's really creative. I was blown away by it when I
Yeah.
saw it. I was like, damn. But yeah, anyway, that's not literature, that's a movie. But that kind of passage of time is great with exposition as well, to show, so that you're not saying like, oh my word, it's been 13 hours since we last spoke and nothing has happened. Yeah. Okay, transitions between scenes. This, we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
exposition is super helpful when we're moving, even, and I don't like, usually we think like transition, this is a problem I realize I'm having in my own writing, is that because I write in chapters, because I like sit down and write a chapter and then like, put it to bed, and then the next day come back and write another chapter, I'm realizing that my chapters have a lot of like short story-esque beginnings and endings. Yeah, where it's like each chapter is a standalone story, which has been, I actually realized that writing a novella, because I'm like, oh wow, I tend to like cliffhang these or write these endings pretty naturally, and then I was like, oh, that might actually be a problem. So it's great for short stories, maybe not so great for my novels. But so even in like the middle of a chapter, giving some exposition to transition between one conversation to the next is super important. And I just read Freaky Deaky by Elmore Leonard, which was our last book club book, and he is so good at this. Like there's a scene where his main character Chris is in a bar talking to one of the suspects, and they're having this very like tricky conversation where the detective wants to ask the suspect direct questions but knows the suspect won't answer them, and the suspect does not want to answer direct questions but is trying to get the detective to go do something. So they're both talking around what's going on, like they're neither of them are saying what they actually want to say. It's just a brilliant conversation. It's like chapter 23, I think, or 24. And then the detective, finally the suspect tells him like, oh, the woman you want to talk to is over in this parking lot. And so then we get 3 paragraphs of the detective going to there's like a paragraph of the detective leaving the bar, a paragraph of the detective thinking about whether or not this woman is actually going to be in the parking lot, and then a paragraph of the detective describing who he meets in the parking lot. And then we're back into another intense conversation with this guy and his like minions in this parking lot the detective goes to meet. And it's one of those moments where it's like, yeah, this is how you transition a scene. You get these like 3 really strong, very strategic paragraphs of exposition that move you from like one big conversation to another big conversation and put you in this moment.
I'll have to read that.
Yeah. I actually don't recommend it. It's super homophobic and a little racist. But it's a study on dialogue.
Maybe I should just go look for that scene.
Just go look for that scene. But yeah, it's definitely, I think in the book club, we decided as we were talking to the book club that it is like an 80s like machismo detective movie on steroids. It's like the lead character even references watching Lethal Weapon, and that's like his big like change moment where he watches Lethal Weapon. He's like, I need to shoot more people like Mel Gibson's character.
So I mean, that's a moment.
Yeah, it's a moment. So I can't recommend the book except for a study in dialogue because it's an amazing study in dialogue. But as far as like an enjoyable read, it's problematic. Yeah. So anyway, we won't go any more into that. I could talk more about it, but we'll just leave it. But yeah, so that's I think that using your exposition really strategically to, like we were saying, move the reader through the world as you transition from one scene to another is super important. And understanding that, like, okay, I think that the struggle that I have with exposition is as I'm transitioning, I tend to get too caught up in my transition. And I'm like 6 paragraphs in before I realize that, like, oh my gosh, my transition's been going on for a year and I'm in trouble. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. Any thoughts on transitioning scenes?
Yeah, I think it is something I struggle with sometimes. Often in the romance, particularly because you're supposed to end like on a very strong emotional moment.
Yeah.
I often will just say F it and let my co-writer do it because she's just really good with emotion. Particularly like with the end of the book.
That's hysterical.
And you do this part.
Did you just put it in brackets? Are you like insert emotional prose here?
Sometimes I'll write something and I'll be like, make this better. Like I'll just highlight it because we do Google Docs and I'll be like, make this better.
That's really funny.
And then she'll write like 5 paragraphs that are all the emotional fluffy goop that people need.
That's awesome. Yeah, we were joking about JP. We were talking about JP earlier. And writing with him, a lot of times I forget names. Like I'm the worst at like details and names. So I just like put in brackets like name of city we are in. And he's like, like
I do enjoy the brackets. I will share that I'm also terrible with names, but I think sometimes that I know what the names are. And when you are writing a romance series, that's not necessarily the best. Because you might have acts happening between people that they should not be happening between.
That's amazing. I imagine your co-author be like, no, you meant these 2 characters.
One got through to publishing. That was a wild ride.
That's fun. Yes. Okay, let's look at this piece. I'm going to share my screen so we can look at it together. So this is, oh my goodness, I can't get to my share screen. There we go. This is the house below the Cerulean Monster Sea.
I'm just gonna continue letting you.
I'm never gonna say it right again. Never gonna say it right again.
So I did verify this is chapter 2. Oh,
nice. Way to go. Okay, what drew you to this piece to talk about exposition with?
Because as we were talking, and as I'm like internally fighting against the Jeff mantra that everything should be dialogue, not everything, but most everything.
I say no more than 3 to 5 paragraphs.
It's like there's really good things with these long expositions. So it's like I was pretty sure that this scene was a really good example. So I went and looked at it and I was like, oh yeah, this is it. This is what I'm sending him.
Yeah. So he starts off with dialogue, Mr. Baker.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that he doesn't say who's speaking. He doesn't tell you who's speaking until like later down. But he starts off with dialogue, and then he's got one, I'm going to skip these little paragraphs, but he's got 1, kind of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 monster, 8 paragraphs before somebody speaks again. So 2 full pages of exposition, but I got to say, it totally drew me in, and I was into it.
It's great.
Yeah, it's really great reading. Yeah. So what did you, before I get into like what I loved about what he was doing, what did you love about what he's doing here in these 8 monster paragraphs?
So first specifically is that this character doesn't speak a lot. He doesn't speak in long sentences. He doesn't expound. This character is very much a quiet person who is very internal, and he's just kind of fit within a system wherever he's at. And so we see here that most of his voice actually comes out in what he pays attention to, what he notices, and what he describes.
Yeah.
And so we get, but without a whole lot of indirect or direct thoughts. So like he couldn't believe it was only Wednesday. That's an indirect thought. He has a lot of thoughts. He's thinking the whole time, and we're getting so much of the dialogue voice.
Yeah. And he made it
never
worse
saying anything
when he realized it was actually Tuesday. Right? Like he's got these 2 like 1 sentence paragraphs. Yeah.
It's like we've all been there. Like that's so relatable.
Yeah. Or he's
Mrs.
got
Jenkins was a stressor. He kept that thought to himself.
Yeah. The hard statement. I loved what he was doing with the hard statement, and then the internal correction was so great, right? Like he couldn't believe it was only Wednesday, and it made it worse when he realized it was a Tuesday. Mrs. Jenkins was a stressor. He kept that thought to himself.
And like he just keeps building up like this anticipation from the moment Mr. Baker in italics, like the second name only in italics, not Mr. Baker.
Mr. Baker,
and we're like, oof, that's not good. And then it gets tense, and like we're waiting for the next thing to be said, and then it's not even the first person, it's his desk worker who is like, "Ooh, you in trouble," building the tension more. And it's all of this exposition is just building the tension. The actual speaking is the punctuation. It is the punches. It's just 2 boxers circling around each other metaphorically with verbal punches.
Yeah. And I love how he builds to it, because he gets down here. I highlighted all the dialogue in yellow, which is something I tend to do. He gets down here where we're like in the thick of the conversation. And so he like you're saying, he like builds you up to it, and then he like jumps into it, and you're on this ride with these characters, which is great. I'm going to accuse him of cheating. It's super creative cheating, and it's like I haven't ever seen it anywhere before, and I love it. I'm totally going to play with it. This third person inner thought is not dialogue. It's definitely exposition. But
so this is called indirect thought. It's literally what this device is called.
Okay, I didn't know the name of it.
Yeah,
it's like 50-50, which struck me as like, oh, he's almost, and it creates that sense of like building to him speaking, because you're getting his. But I think what most of us do as authors is we make this a direct thought and we put it in italics, and this is more effective.
This is my preferred method, whether you're doing first person point of view or third person limited point of view. And that's what we are here. We're in Linus's head, but we are not in first person where he's saying, I did this, I did that. Linus, thought to himself. And it's his thoughts we're hearing. It's his descriptions we're seeing. It's how he thinks of things that were in his point of view. It's my favorite way to tell a story, either first person or third person limited, but with this indirect thought, because it immerses you so deeply into the scene.
And part of what he's doing here, which is interesting with this third person indirect thought, which is something I'm now going to add to my vocabulary. As somebody who didn't study, like the only class I failed in college was freshman English. The only class I ever failed ever was freshman English. So as somebody who has, and I grew up in a quasi ghetto high school where we like didn't actually read books. So second to none. So that was our high school team. So for me, like I feel like I'm constantly discovering new things that most people just learned in like grammar. But so all that to say, what he's doing here that I love.
So that to say, I don't think they cover this in normal English classes.
Okay.
I think I
always have to assume that like all other writers know this, and I'm like, I'm the only one that doesn't know it. It's new to me. What he's doing here that I love is this, like the paragraphs are either descriptions of how other people are moving or reflections of the past. And then his third person indirect thoughts are about how he feels in the moment. And that's part of what creates this like building dynamic, is you get these little shots of how he feels right now that like are building to his first utterance. In it for now, he muttered to Linus. Or no, that's not his first, that's his friend's utterance. His first utterance actually doesn't come until down here. Or is that his first utterance?
Yeah, it's further. Like we still haven't gotten to his.
He muttered to Linus. No, this is his first utterance. In it for now, he muttered to Linus. This is his first utterance.
That's not Linus speaking though. That's the guy next to him.
Oh, you're right. That's the guy next to him. So it's down here. This is his first utterance. Mrs. Jenkins, he said in a voice barely above a whisper, It's nice to see you today. This was a lie. It was never nice to see you.
I stomped my feet in delight so many times in the first 45 pages of this book, just in pure joy at the repartee that happens. Wait till you get to the secretary when you read it. It's great.
Oh, but that even right here, that like line of like inner correction that he's doing is so great. It's just fantastic. Or like here, even after he speaks, you get down here where it's like, the only things that belonged to him were the clothes on his back and the mouse pad, a faded picture of a white sandy beach and the bluest ocean in the world. Across the top was the legend, "Don't you wish you were here?" Yes, daily. Like, is that like
so good?
Yeah, that inner thought where he's like, just like commenting to himself on what's going on is so great.
So what I want to point out, and that I think we're going to go over the writing exercise I have that like kind of emphasizes this kind of point of view and exposition, is everything Linus is describing, he has an opinion about it. He's not just like the room was big and large. It's how does it affect him? If it doesn't affect him, he doesn't mention it. The reason he has that mouse pad of the ocean is he's never seen the ocean. He's fascinated with it. It means something to him. He has an opinion about it. He wishes he was there daily. Down at the bottom of the screen, Gunther scratched something on his clipboard. He describes something that happens and then he gives an opinion. He was probably giving Linus yet another demerit for the obvious sweat stains under his arms. An opinion, and his descriptions of other people. What are they thinking about me? Like, how does it affect? Because we're self-centered creatures, right? Or what is my opinion about what they're doing? That's what description, in my opinion, should be. Like from a distinct point of view, because when it matters to someone, then it matters to us as the reader.
Well, and that goes into setting the emotional tone, like we were talking about with prose too, is that like if your character has an opinion about what's being described, that opinion helps build the emotional tone of the moment, right? Like even thinking back to the quote you gave that starts the Lord of the Rings series, you know, Tolkien there is even taking a step back to talk about not this kind of muddy hole, but this kind of hole in the ground, right?
That
like
meant comfort. There's the opinion.
There's the opinion, like landing that opinion in the prose of like, hey, here's what's really important.
Like, you know, if you start describing it was a beautiful sunrise, you know, the birds were chirping, who cares?
Yeah.
The beautiful sunrise belied like his despair. Why couldn't it be a stormy, rainy morning to reflect like, you know, his inner turmoil? Like, you know, like you've got to have an opinion, like, oh, beautiful sunrise.
Yeah. And the birds were chirping, which she really wished would stop because she was hungover from the night before.
Yeah.
And their chirps sounded like piercing knives. Yeah.
Were like someone banging a triangle stick on her head, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that like, yeah, you're totally right. I love that.
How does it affect the point of view character?
Yeah, totally. That's 100% flat on. Okay, so talk to us about the exercise. What's the you shared it in Slack, but I don't want to spoil it.
Yeah, so I learned this from Mary Robinette Kowal, and so if you are listening and you want to try this writing exercise, you can save it, or you can kind of Google this, but it's quite simple. But the first thing you're going to do is you're going to sit wherever you are, and you are going to write for 5 to 10 minutes, set a timer, and describe the room you're in using third person. Do not describe any other humans unless they interact with the room and make it react, like a squeaky chair. And try to use all 5 senses. Write the entire time and try not to stop. The longer you can do this, the more you'll get out of it. And then if you're doing this in a group, or by yourself, underline the first thing you describe. If you're in a group, have everybody shout it out and kind of see. There'll often be a mix up of sight and sound, or sight and sound use, hearing tend to be the ones that are accessed the most, but some people will have touch or taste or smell. Taste is often the least used. And see how many of everything that you did use, and just kind of see where your balance is. And that's just an awareness thing. There's no right or wrong on that. But if you're only using sight, then you do need to like expand.
Yeah.
So then you're going to do the exercise again. Same room. Don't change it. Don't pick a better room just because it's more interesting to describe. The more boring, the better, honestly. But the second time that you do it, you're going to give your character an easily specified role. And when I say easily specified, like someone who you can be like, yes, they are a blah, blah, blah. They are a janitor. They are a ballerina. They're a bassist, a broker, a child, a grandmother. And then you are going to describe the room from their point of view. And if you're doing this in a group, then you want to kind of exchange pieces and see if the other person can define your role that you gave them without you ever using that word.
Nice.
Because if you've done it right, they're going to be like, oh, they're a dancer. Oh, they're a musician. Oh, they're a janitor.
Yeah.
Because you're going to use the things that they're going to see are going to be different than the things a janitor sees are going to be completely different than how things a ballerina notices.
Yeah. As somebody who's worked janitorial work in a retail store, I can tell you that's 100%
right.
true.
You just all of a sudden see all the tiny bits of paper on the floor.
Yeah. I saw every scratch on the floor that I was going to have to like wax out later. I was like, damn it, there's another one. Yeah.
And then you're going to do this a third time. And each time set your timer right for the whole time. Your third time, same exercise, same character, but give your character a strong emotion. You're not allowed to use that word, the word of that emotion in the scene. How does that change how they describe everything?
Yeah, that's great. I love the idea of like an emotional colored lens for the description is fantastic versus a role colored lens.
If you can exchange it with someone and see if they can pick out both the role and the emotion, great. Like that's
such a great exercise. That's fantastic. I love it.
And so with this, you're using all the tools that you have taught people to create about their dialogue voice, because their point of view voice should be a part of that whole matrix of how their voice sounds in their different emotional states.
Yep. Yeah, it should all lend to their character voice. It should all come out of them.
And it should. So it won't necessarily always be the same as their speaking voice, as we saw in the House in the Cerulean Sea.
Yeah.
His external speaking voice, very, very short, tries not to say anything extra, but internally he's always going over something, but it's, but that's part of the matrix.
Yeah, and I haven't read the book yet, but even in this piece, I can tell that like his internal voice is a modulation of his external voice. Like his external voice is like more hesitant, and there's a lot of broken sentences, and there's a lot of like starting and like half finishing. Whereas
he retracts his thoughts all the time.
But his thoughts are more filled out. There's less like not saying what he wants to say, but there's still that like, it's still short, it's still tight, it's still like, but again, I'm just looking at this chapter, but he definitely has a clear like external internal voice that are connected to each other. And I love what you're saying about like that needs to be connected to how they view the room as well, and like how they're understanding the descriptions, and like how they're bringing the reader into their worldview. I mean,
cool. Another exercise you could do is you're looking at this scene from imagine you're telling it from the point of view of Miss Jenkins. What different things would she notice?
Yeah.
All of the workers in a line. That person has a pencil slightly out of, place or whatever. What things are they noticing? Like, does she notice that stain? She absolutely
she totally saw Linus's stain the moment she walked into the room. Yeah.
And she'll have satisfaction at Gunther's little like cattiness, supporting her. And the room she sees is going to be very different than the room than Linus sees, and that Gunther sees.
Yeah, Gunther's probably just going to see her the whole time, which is a different,
and his little numbers, and like how many people, like who can I write up?
And you can also see Gunther like making notations, which isn't mentioned here, but then immediately looking to her to make sure that she's giving approval of like what he's like scratching on his pen. But and noticing things about her that like they're not noticing because they're so anxious.
And one of the things that, spoiler, you'll see throughout this story is how those internal thoughts slowly start to make it into the external. And that's part of his growth arc.
I like that.
He never fully changes because he shouldn't.
No.
But like there's this subtle shift of it so that you can see that growth.
We changed characters in baby steps, not leaps. Leaps can make the reader go like, really? The reader will never put in your review, this character changed too fast. The reader will go, nah, I didn't buy it.
I didn't believe it.
No, I didn't get it. Something happened in the middle of the book that made me go, anyway. Learning to speak reader 101. I don't like it. Means so many different things. All right. Anything else we want to add about? I love those exercises. Thank you. I'm going to put them in the newsletter that week. I'm going to type them up and so everybody can actually see them. Anything else you want to talk about?
Nah.
Thanks for coming on. This was fantastic.
Thanks for letting me barge my way in.
Anytime. You're welcome all times in the Dialogue Doctor White Room. You're welcome to barge in whenever you want.
Excellent. I shall bring the color.
I'm going to stop the recording and we can talk some more.